The rain fell like needles on the cracked sidewalks of Los Angeles, cold and relentless. People hurried past storefronts, collars turned up, eyes fixed on the ground. No one noticed the hunched figure sitting under a torn awning, his hands shaking as he clutched a soggy cardboard sign. His clothes were stiff with dirt, his beard matted, and his boots split at the seams. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. The coins in his cup barely covered the bottom. Then he saw him. A black SUV rolled to a stop at the curb. The door opened, and out stepped a man in a tailored trench coat, his stride steady, his posture sharp even at his age. The homeless man's breath caught. Clint Eastwood. The legend himself, his face etched with the same grit he'd shown in 100 films. Without thinking, the homeless man lurched to his feet, his heart pounding. This might be his only chance. He stumbled into the street, ignoring the honking cars, rainwater soaking through his threadbare jacket. Clint was halfway to the door of a boutique hotel when the homeless man called out, his voice cracking. Mr. Eastwood, please. Just $1. Anything." Clint stopped. Turned slowly. His gaze, like flint, locked onto the man. For a long moment, he said nothing. The rain drummed between them. The homeless man braced himself for a curse, a dismissal. He'd heard it all before. But Clint's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in scrutiny. Like he was peeling back layers, seeing something no one else did. "You ask for $1, Clint said finally, his voice low and rough. "But what you need ain't in your hand." He reached into his coat, and for a wild second, the man thought he'd pull out a wallet. Instead, Clint held out a business card, crisp and white against the gray downpour. "Be at this address tomorrow. 6 a.m. Don't be late." The homeless man stared, trembling. The card had a ranch logo, coordinates, and a single word handwritten in ink, work. Before he could speak, Clint turned and vanished into the hotel. Staggering back to the awning, the man collapsed, clutching the card like a lifeline. His mind raced. Was this a joke? A trick? But Clint's eyes hadn't lied. There'd been no pity there, only a challenge. A spark. That night, he barely slept. At dawn, he hitchhiked to the edge of the city, following the directions to a sprawling ranch nestled in the hills. The gates were iron, the fields endless. A crew of men in work boots eyed him as he approached, their skepticism thick in the morning air. Clint stood on the porch, arms crossed, as the homeless man stopped at the foot of the steps. "You came," Clint said. "Why you said, work," the man stammered. Clint nodded. "Ever mended a fence? Trailed cattle?" The man swallowed. I can learn." A flicker of a smile crossed Clint's face. "We'll see." He tossed him a pair of gloves. "Start with the stables. And clean up first, you smell like regret." The crew chuckled, but the homeless man didn't care. For the first time in years, his chest burned with something besides hunger. Hope. But as he scrubbed grease off tractors later that day, blisters forming on his palms, he couldn't shake the question, why him? What did Clint see in a broken man the world had thrown away? He'd find out soon enough. The rhythmic clang of metal echoed through the ranch's stable as the man scrubbed rust off a horseshoe. Sweat dripped down his neck, mixing with the dust that coated his skin. The blisters on his palms had burst hours ago, but he didn't stop. Work was a distraction, a way to silence the memories gnawing at the edges of his mind. But when a horse nearby whinnied sharply, the sound sliced through his focus. His hands froze. That noise. It was the same desperate cry he'd heard years ago, the day his life unraveled. 5 years earlier. He'd been a different man then. Strong. Reliable. A construction worker who rose before dawn, his hands calloused from swinging hammers and hauling steel. He'd built skyscrapers in the city, their glass facades glinting like trophies under the sun. At home, a wife and daughter waited, their laughter filling a small house with ivy crawling up the walls. He'd framed their family photos himself, steady hands, steady life. But everything changed on a half-finished bridge over the Los Angeles River. He'd been balancing on an I-beam, the wind biting through his jacket, when his boot slipped. The safety harness should have held. It would have held, if his best friend, the foreman, hadn't approved cheap replacements to pocket extra cash. The strap snapped. He fell 3 stories. The crash of his body against concrete was drowned out by the roar of machinery. When he woke in the hospital, his right leg was bolted together with metal, his spine a live wire of pain. The doctor said he'd never work construction again. The lawyer said the lawsuit against the company would take years. And his friend? He vanished, leaving behind a handwritten note, "Sorry, brother. I've got a family too." The compensation check, when it finally came, was a fraction of what he'd lost. Medical bills devoured it. Pride stopped him from begging for help. He hid the eviction notice from his wife, shoved his daughter's birthday gift, a tiny silver horse pendant, deeper into his pocket when he couldn't afford to wrap it. "I'll fix this," he'd promised, his voice hollow. He didn't. 3 years earlier. The first pill was a gift from a stranger in a bar. For the pain, the man said, sliding the bottle across the sticky counter. It worked. For a while, the numbness was a relief. But the pills grew teeth. They ate his savings, his dignity, his marriage. His wife's face, once soft with love, hardened into disgust. "You're not the man I married," she spat the night she left, dragging their sobbing daughter to a waiting car. He didn't chase them. The streets swallowed him whole after that. He slept under freeway overpasses, his leg throbbing in the cold. The horse pendant, still unwrapped, became a secret weight in his coat, a reminder of the father he'd failed to be. Some nights, he'd clutch it and whisper apologies to the dark. Most nights, he drowned in shame. Present day. Back in the stable, the man blinked, the horseshoe trembling in his grip. The ranch's foreman barked at him to keep working, but the memories clung like cobwebs. He'd been so sure he deserved the ruin, that the streets were his penance. Until Clint Eastwood handed him a card and a sliver of something he'd forgotten, purpose. That night, as he lay on a cot in the ranch's bunkhouse, he reached into his boot. The horse pendant glinted in the moonlight, still sealed in its tiny box. His throat tightened. Somewhere out there, his daughter was 12 years old. Did she still love horses? Did she even remember him? He stuffed the pendant back into his boot, guilt sour in his chest. But as he drifted into uneasy sleep, a resolve began to harden, one blistered hand at a time. The ranch's mess hall buzzed with the clatter of plates and the low grumble of ranch hands. The man sat alone at the end of a long wooden table, hunched over a bowl of stew. His muscles ached, his hands raw, but the food tasted like heaven. Across the room, a crew member slapped a newspaper onto the counter. The headline screamed, "Clint's latest role, Saint or Sucker?" A grainy photo beneath the text showed Clint handing him the business card in the rain. The caption read, "Eastwood's charity project, or midlife crisis?" The man's spoon froze midway to his mouth. His face burned as laughter erupted from the crew. "Hey, St. Clint," one of them jeered. "You gonna save us all next?" Another mimed holding out a cup, "Spare some wisdom, sensei?" Clint strode into the mess hall then, his presence snapping the room to silence. He ignored the newspaper, his eyes landing on the man. "You." "My office." "Now." The office was sparse, a desk, a leather chair, and walls lined with framed movie posters and faded ranch maps. Clint didn't sit. He leaned against the desk, arms folded, staring at the man. "You read that trash?" The man nodded, staring at his boots. "You believe it?" "And no, sir." Clint snorted. "Good. 'Cause that's what it is, trash. But it's gonna get worse. Reporters'll swarm. They'll dig up your past. Your mistakes. You ready for that?" The man's throat tightened. They'd find out about the pills. The abandonment. The pendant hidden in his boot. I don't know. Clint grunted. Neither do I. But here's the thing, he picked up a brass belt buckle from his desk, polished to a shine. My old man gave me this when I was 16. He lost our farm in 37. Bank took it all. Know what he did after? The man shook his head. He got a job sweeping floors at a picture house. Hated every damn minute. But he did it so I could eat. Pride's a luxury, son. You wanna survive? Swallow it. The man's jaw clenched. Why'd you pick me? Clint turned the buckle in his hands. Saw myself in you. Stubborn. Angry. Too damn tired to quit. He set it down. Now get back to work. The next morning, the man woke before dawn. The bunkhouse reeked of sweat and hay, but he didn't mind. He'd started to memorize the rhythms of the ranch, the creak of the windmill, the distant lowing of cattle. That day, Clint assigned him to repair an old tractor that had been rusting in the field for years. Fix it, he said, tossing him a toolbox. Or don't. Your call. The man knelt in the dirt, grease coating his arms as he pried open the tractor's engine. To his surprise, his hands remembered things his mind had forgotten. Wires, valves, the hum of machinery, it all felt familiar. By sunset, the engine sputtered to life, black smoke billowing into the pink sky. The crew stopped to stare. Even Clint raised an eyebrow. Not bad, he muttered. But as the man wiped his hands, a black sedan rolled up the ranch driveway. A woman in a sharp blazer stepped out, her phone pointed like a weapon. Sir, she called. I'm with Daily Times. Care to comment on rumors you're using Clint Eastwood to fund your drug habit? The man froze. How did she know? Before he could speak, Clint materialized beside him. You got a permit to be here? He growled. The reporter faltered. Mr. Eastwood, the public deserves to know. What they deserve, Clint cut in, is a little damn respect. Now get off my land. As the sedan sped away, the man's chest heaved. They'll keep coming, won't they? Clint lit a cigar, the smoke curling into the twilight. Yep. But you're safer here than out there. He paused. Unless you want to run. The man looked at the tractor, still rumbling like a heartbeat. I'm staying. Clint nodded. Then tomorrow, you'll fix the truck. The ranch's pickup truck was a relic, a 1970s Chevy with a dented hood and seats, cracked like desert soil. Clint tossed the man a set of keys the next morning. Transmission shot. Fix it or push it into the ravine. The crew snickered, but the man just nodded. He'd spent the night lying awake, replaying the reporter's words. Drug habit. The label clung to him like the stench of old smoke. But today, he'd prove them wrong. Under the truck's hood, the engine was a tangled maze of rust and grease. The man ran his fingers along the carburetor, his mind drifting to the bridge collapse. Back then, he'd been the one crews called to troubleshoot faulty equipment. He'd built things. Now, he rebuilt them. By midday, his hands moved with a rhythm he'd thought lost. He hummed an old song his daughter used to love, the melody threading through the clatter of tools. When the crew boss wandered over, he barked, "You gonna stare all day or hand me that wrench?" The man froze, shocked at his own boldness. But the crew boss smirked and passed him the tool. As the sun dipped, the truck roared to life, its engine growling like a waking beast. The crew gathered, their mockery replaced by grudging nods. Clint stood in the shadows, silent. But when the man caught his eye, Clint tipped his hat, a gesture so slight it could have been a trick of the light. That night, Clint found him oiling tools in the barn. "You're handy," he said, leaning against a hay bale. "Where'd you learn?" The man hesitated. "Construction. Before the fall." Clint chewed on a toothpick. "My old man was a mechanic. Fixed tractors during the Dust Bowl. Folks paid him in eggs and curses." He paused, staring at the rafters. "One winter, a storm took our barn. He rebuilt it alone, hands bleeding through his gloves. I asked him why he didn't quit. Know what he said? The man shook his head. Ain't about the barn, Clint muttered. It's about proving the storm wrong. The words hung in the air, heavy as the hay dust. The man gripped the oil rag, his throat tight. Did it work? Clint shrugged. Barn's still here. He gestured to the weathered beams above him. So's the lesson. Meanwhile, in the city. The reporter from the Daily Times sat in a sleek office, scrolling through court records. Her editor wanted dirt on Clint's pet project, but she'd stumbled onto something juicier. The homeless man's lawsuit against his old construction company, buried under layers of sealed settlements. And then she found him, the foreman who'd vanished after the accident. A few clicks revealed his new life, a luxury condo, a LinkedIn profile touting his entrepreneurial vision. She dialed his number, her pulse quickening. "This is a private line," a crisp voice answered. "Mr. Daniels? I'm writing a story about an old friend of yours. The one you left to die on a bridge." Silence. Then a sharp inhale. "Who the hell is this?" Back at the ranch. The man sat on the bunkhouse steps, the horse pendant warm in his palm. Moonlight glinted off its silver curves. He'd almost thrown it away a dozen times, almost, but never did. "You gonna stare at that all night?" He jumped. Clint stood behind him, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "It's for my daughter," the man admitted, snapping the pendant box shut. "Never gave it to her." Clint sat down, the wood creaking under his weight. "Kids don't need trinkets. They need you to show up." He sipped his coffee, staring into the dark. "You will. When you're ready." The man pocketed the pendant, Clint's quiet confidence seeping into his bones. But as he lay in bed later, a text buzzed on the crew boss's phone across the room. "Unknown number, tell your new pet I'm coming. He owes me." The foreman's hand shook as he paced his penthouse, the city lights blurring beneath him. The reporter's call had cracked open a vault he'd sealed years ago. "They know." He poured himself a whiskey, the ice clinking like bones. His reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows looked distorted, a ghost of the man who'd once swung hammers alongside his best friend. Guilt was a luxury he'd buried under Rolexes and real estate. But now, it clawed its way back. He scrolled through old photos on his phone, stopping at one, 2 men in hard hats, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning on that damned bridge. He zoomed in on his friend's face, young, trusting, alive. A text notification interrupted the memory. Daily Times reporter. "Meet me tomorrow. Or I publish everything." The foreman crushed the phone in his fist. At the ranch. The man woke to the smell of smoke. He bolted from the bunkhouse, following the haze, to the barn. Flames licked at the hayloft, orange tongues devouring the rafters Clint's father had rebuilt decades ago. The crew scrambled, passing buckets from the well, but the man sprinted past them. He'd seen fires on construction sites, water alone wouldn't kill this. Grabbing a shovel, he scaled the ladder and attacked the burning hay, hurling it into the dirt. Embers seared his arms, but he didn't stop. Below, Clint barked orders, his voice steady but strained. When the last flame died, the man collapsed in the ash, his lungs raw. Clint hauled him up by the collar. "Sabotage," he hissed. Fuel can was tipped. Deliberate. The man's blood ran cold. Who'd want to burn down a barn? The reporter's move. She arrived at noon, her sedan kicking up dust. The man was repairing a fence when she cornered him. "Your old foreman's name is Paul Daniels," she said, shoving a photo in his face. "Recognize him?" The man dropped his pliers. The face in the photo was older, softer, but unmistakable. His best friend. The one who'd vanished. "He's worth millions now," the reporter pressed. "Built his empire on insurance fraud. Your accident was his first score." The man's vision blurred. Rage, hot and sour, surged in his chest. "Get out," he growled. He's coming for you, she said. And when he does, I'll be there. Clint's warning. That evening, Clint found the man sharpening axes in the tool shed. You're hunting ghosts, Clint said, leaning in the doorway. He's no ghost, the man snapped. He's a thief. A liar. So were you. The words landed like a slap. Clint stepped closer, his voice low. You think I didn't know about the pills? The lies? Redemption ain't about being clean. It's about getting up after you're dirty. He tossed him a set of truck keys. Charity project starts tomorrow. You're leading it. The man stared. Why me? Because, Clint said, turning away, the crew listens to you now. Midnight visitor. The man was checking the barn locks when headlights pierced the dark. A black SUV rolled to a stop, and out stepped Paul Daniels, designer suit, polished shoes, eyes hollow with fear. You look like hell, Paul said, forcing a laugh. The man's fists clenched. You burned the barn. Paul raised his hands. I just want to talk. That reporter's gonna ruin us both. Take this, he shoved an envelope bulging with cash. Disappear. I'll make it worth your while. The man looked at the money, then at Paul. For a heartbeat, the old friendship flickered, campfires, shared beers, promises to have each other's backs. Then he hurled the envelope into the dirt. You don't get to run this time. Paul's smile twisted. Wrong answer. A snap of his fingers, and two men climbed out of the SUV, their faces shadowed. Should have taken the cash, brother. The man braced for the blow, but headlights flooded the scene. Clint's truck roared up, the high beams pinning Paul like a bug. Evenin', gentlemen, Clint drawled, stepping out with a shotgun cradled in his arms. Party's over. Paul paled. This isn't your fight, old man. Clint pumped the shotgun. My ranch. My fight. The thugs retreated. Paul spat into the dust before speeding off, his tires screeching into the night. Clint lowered the gun, eyeing the man. You okay? The man nodded, trembling. Thanks. Don't thank me yet, Clint said, grimacing as he rubbed his chest. This war's just starting. The charity project began at dawn, a community center for homeless veterans, its skeleton of beams rising from the dust. The man stood at the site, blueprints clenched in his hands. Clint had handed him the plans that morning, his voice gruff, but eyes bright. Don't mess it up. Now, crews buzzed around him, hammering and shouting, their respect earned blistered hand by blistered hand. But as the sun climbed, Clint's absence gnawed at him. The old man had stayed in his truck, hunched over the steering wheel, face pale. When the man approached, Clint waved him off. Indigestion, he grumbled. Keep 'em moving. By noon, the first wall stood upright. The man allowed himself a smile, until a voice cut through the noise. Dad? He turned. A teenage girl stood at the edge of the site, her hair streaked with pink, her eyes his own. His breath stopped. His daughter. She stepped closer, fists trembling. I saw you on the news. With him. She jerked her chin toward Clint's truck. You're a hero now? The crew slowed, watching. The man's throat tightened. I wanted to call. You left. Her voice cracked. Mom cried every night. I thought you were dead. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing the pendant. I wanted to come back. I just couldn't. Couldn't? She laughed, sharp and broken. You chose pills over us. The words hung, raw and suffocating. Clint's truck door creaked open, drawing their eyes. The old man staggered out, clutching his chest, his face ashen. Clint. The man sprinted toward him as Clint collapsed. Med kit, he barked at the crew. Call 911. Cradling Clint's head, he fumbled for a pulse. Weak, but there. Clint's eyes fluttered open. Kid, he rasped. Don't let the storm win. The man's daughter stood frozen nearby, anger warring with shock. He met her gaze. Help me. For a heartbeat, she hesitated. Then she knelt, pressing her hands over Clint's. What do I do? Keep pressure here, he said, guiding her. His fingers brushed hers, a fragile bridge. Sirens wailed in the distance. Later, at the hospital. Clint slept, machines beeping softly. The man slumped in a chair outside the room, his daughter pacing. He'll live, the doctor had said. But he needs rest. The girl stopped, arms crossed. Why do you care about him? The man pulled out the pendant, tarnished but gleaming. He gave me a second chance. Like I'm asking you. She stared at the horse, tears spilling. You don't get to ask. I know. He set it on the chair between them. But I'm here. However long it takes. She left without touching it. But it was gone when he returned, a silent hope. That night. Back at the ranch, the man found a note nailed to the barn, last warning. Walk away. Paul's work. He crumpled it, then froze. On his cot lay the horse pendant, polished bright. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and wilted flowers. Clint lay propped up in bed, tubes snaking from his arms, his face ashen, but eyes still sharp. The man hovered in the doorway, guilt knotting his gut. Should have been there sooner, he muttered. Clint scowled. Quit mopin'. You got a job to finish. He tossed a folded newspaper onto the bedside table. The headline blared, Eastwood's protege faces new threats, charity project in jeopardy. The man flinched. Reporters still circling? Like vultures, Clint said. But that ain't your problem. Daniel's is. He leaned forward, wincing. You let him scare you, he wins. Again. The man nodded, fists clenched. I'll handle it. Clint smirked. Damn right. Now get out of here. Back at the ranch. The charity site was chaos. A bulldozer sat idle, its engine gutted. The crew boss kicked a tire, swearing. Fuel lines cut. Again. The man knelt, inspecting the damage. Salvage what you can. We'll use the tractors. Tractors? The crew boss snorted. We'll be here till Christmas. The man stood, dusting his hands. Then we'll work Christmas. The crew fell silent, watching him. For the first time, there was no mockery, only grudging respect. A fragile truce. His daughter appeared at sunset, her pink-streaked hair hidden under a baseball cap. She lingered at the edge of the site, clutching a clipboard. The nurse said Clint's okay, she said stiffly. He's tough, the man replied, avoiding her eyes. She scuffed her boot in the dirt. They need volunteers at the soup kitchen. For the vets. He froze. You staying? Not for you, she snapped. For them. He hid a smile. Kitchen's that way. Midnight shadows. The man was patrolling the site when headlights slashed through the dark. Two figures emerged from a van, crowbars in hand. He recognized them, Paul's thugs. Boss says hi, one sneered, swinging at a generator. The man lunged, tackling him. They crashed into the dirt, fists flying. The second thug yanked him off, but a roar split the air. The crew boss and 3 ranch hands charged in, wielding wrenches. The thugs fled, but not before snarling, "This ain't over." The crew boss hauled the man up. You okay? He wiped blood from his lip. Yeah. Thanks. The crew boss shrugged. We don't let family fight alone. Daughter in danger. The next morning, his daughter didn't show. The man's chest tightened. He found her backpack near the soup kitchen tent, overturned. A note fluttered in the wind, want her back? Walk away. P. Rage blurred his vision. He tore toward Clint's truck, but a hand yanked him back, his daughter, alive, eyes blazing. "I'm here," she said, shaking. "They cornered me, but I ran." She held up her phone. Recorded everything. His voice. His threats. The man pulled her into a hug, relief crushing him. She stiffened, then slowly hugged back. "We take this to the cops," she said. He shook his head. "Paul's got lawyers. Cops'll stall. We finish the build. Then we bury him." Clint's return. 3 days later, Clint limped onto the site, leaning on a cane. The crew erupted in cheers. He ignored them, squinting at the near-finished community center. "Not bad," he grunted to the man. "Your plans," the man said. "Your sweat," Clint countered. He nodded at the man's daughter, serving meals to veterans. "Hers?" The man swallowed. "Maybe." Clint clapped his shoulder. "Storm's almost over." But as the sun set, Paul's SUV crawled past the ranch gates, a silent promise. The grand opening of the Veterans Community Center buzzed with laughter and applause. Families mingled under strings of lights, veterans swapping stories around picnic tables, and children chasing fireflies. The man stood at the edge of the crowd, his daughter beside him, both stiff but united. Clint held court near the grill, his cane tapping rhythmically as he charmed donors with stories of old Hollywood. For a moment, it felt like peace. Then the lights died. A hush fell. Headlights speared the darkness as Paul's SUV rolled into the center of the gathering. He stepped out, flanked by lawyers and a camera crew. The reporter from the Daily Times trailed behind, smirking. "Ladies and gentlemen," Paul announced, spreading his arms. "Before you celebrate, you should know the truth. This project?" He gestured to the building. "Built by a drug addict. Funded by a washed-up actor playing hero." The crowd murmured. Clint's grip tightened on his cane. The man stepped forward, but his daughter grabbed his arm. "Wait," she whispered, pulling out her phone. Paul smirked. "Your savior here," he pointed at the man, "abandoned his family. Stole from his coworkers. And Clint Eastwood?" He turned to the cameras. "He's covering it up, to save his legacy." Clint limped into the light, his voice a growl. "You're trespassing, Daniels." "Arrest me?" Paul laughed. "I've got proof. Emails. Bank records. This whole project's a tax scam." He nodded to the reporter, who held up a folder. "Check the files, folks. The truth's ugly." The crowd erupted, shouts, gasps, phones recording. The man's chest heaved. This was it. Paul had weaponized his past to bury them all. Then a voice cut through the noise. "You want truth?" The man's daughter strode into the spotlight, her phone raised. The crowd stilled as Paul's recorded voice boomed, "Walk away. Or I'll make sure your kid disappears." Paul's smile faltered. She scrolled, playing another clip. "Your accident was my first score." "That's enough." Paul lunged for her phone, but the ranch crew blocked him, forming a wall. The man stepped forward, facing the cameras. "Paul Daniels rigged the bridge collapse that broke my life. He ran. I ran too, from my family, my mistakes. But Clint?" He turned to the old man. "He taught me to stop running." Clint nodded, pride flickering in his gaze. Paul backed toward his SUV, but red and blue lights flashed as police cars skidded into the lot. The reporter paled, edging away. "I had no idea." "Save it," an officer snapped, cuffing Paul. "We've got your files. And a lot of questions." As Paul was shoved into a cruiser, the crowd erupted in cheers. Clint clapped the man's shoulder. "Told you the storm'd pass." But the man's eyes were on his daughter. She stood alone, hugging herself. He approached, the pendant warm in his palm. "You saved us," he said. She stared at the silver horse. "I didn't do it for you." "I know." He pressed it into her hand. But thank you anyway. She closed her fingers around it, silent. Later that night, the man found Clint on the porch of the community center, staring at the stars. You okay? Clint grunted. Tired. But it's a good tired. He paused. You know what comes next? The man sat beside him. The foundation. Helping others like me. Clint nodded. And her? He nodded toward the man's daughter, laughing with veterans at a bonfire. One day at a time, the man said. Clint pulled a flask from his coat, took a sip, and handed it over. The whiskey burned, but the man didn't flinch. For the first time in years, the heat felt like hope. The sun dipped low over the ranch, painting the sky in streaks of gold and violet. The Veterans Community Center hummed with life, laughter from a group sharing stories, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the strum of a guitar on the porch. The man stood at the edge of the field, watching his daughter teach a young boy to braid reins from old rope. Her voice, patient and warm, carried on the breeze. She wore the horse pendant now, its silver catching the light. Clint found him there, leaning heavier on his cane than he'd ever admit. Still ain't used to crowds, huh? The man smiled. Getting there. They stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words settling between them. Finally, Clint cleared his throat. Got something for you. He handed over a deed, the paper crisp and official. The man squinted. The ranch? Nah. The foundation. It's yours now. Clint's eyes crinkled. Figured you'd know what to do with it. The man stared at the document, Eastwood Grace Foundation for Second Chances, his throat tight. Why? Clint shrugged. 'Cause I'm old, kid. And you? He nodded toward the crowd. You're just getting started. A month later, the foundation's first outreach camp opened on the ranch. Veterans and homeless families pitched tents under the oaks, their voices mingling around bonfires. The man's daughter moved among them, passing out supplies, her laughter lighter now. When a grizzled vet hesitated to take a blanket, she said, "My dad says pride's a luxury." Swallow it. The man overheard, his chest swelling. He'd spent years running from the word dad. Now, it felt like a gift. That night, he found her by the fire, the pendant glowing against her shirt. You're good at this, he said. She poked the embers. Learned from a stubborn old man. A pause. And you? Clint's last lesson. The next morning, Clint was gone. He left no note, no goodbye, just his brass belt buckle on the porch rail, polished to a mirror shine. The man held it, remembering Clint's story about his father. Ain't about the barn. It's about proving the storm wrong. At sunset, the man climbed the hill behind the ranch, where Clint had once pointed out constellations. He buried the buckle under a young oak, its roots digging deep into the soil. Thanks, old man, he whispered. When he returned, his daughter waited at the cabin door. You okay? He nodded. He's where he needs to be. Epilogue, 5 years later. The foundation had spread to 3 states. The man's daughter, now in college, ran their youth mentorship program. They didn't talk about the lost years anymore. Some wounds stayed scars, but they no longer bled. One evening, as the man locked up the community center, a stranger approached, a homeless vet, his eyes hollow, hands shaking. Heard you help folks, he mumbled. The man studied him, seeing the reflection of his own past. Ever mend a fence? He asked, tossing him a pair of gloves. The vet caught them, confusion turning to wary hope. I can learn. The man smiled. We'll see. As they walked toward the ranch, the first stars blinked awake. Somewhere, the man knew, Clint was scowling at the sky, lighting a cigar, and muttering, "'Bout damn time." The end.